Hello, good evening, and welcome to this evening's class. Please, if you can hear me, raise your hand up. If you can hear me, please raise your hand up. Okay, so quite a lot of you can hear me, so you can lower your hand now. I don't know what's up with attendance. Is it because it's a Sunday evening and some are still sleeping? At the moment, we have about 74 of us here, but I'm going to start. So I hope the number would increase as we um, go along with the class. All right. So today I am going to do two things. One is to complete the last section, and then the second one is to start a new section, which is on the concept of demand and supply elasticity. So for the completion of the last session, there was the issue of price control, which I would quickly discuss with you before I move on to the discussion of the concept of elasticity. Right. So now we know how market works, particularly a free market system. We know how equilibrium prices and quantities are determined. And we also know how changes in demand and supply affect equilibrium price and quantity. So note that prices in a free market system are determined by the forces of demand and supply. And the fact that a particular price is an equilibrium price does not mean that it remains there forever. The forces of demand and supply change these equilibrium. So it moves to a different economic equilibrium. So we have looked at how changes in demand alone can influence equilibrium price. We have also looked at how changes in supply alone can influence equilibrium price. And then we've looked at how a change in both, either in the same direction or in different direction, can influence equilibrium price. So today we will look at government intervention in this market. So if you remember, in a free market system, we said there is no state intervention, but in a mix, there is government intervention. So if government feels that the market allocation is not welfare improving or enhancing, then it can intervene in this market by setting price. So that is what we mean by price control. All right. Now, when it comes to price control, there are two forms of price control. There is what we call price ceiling or the maximum price, and there is also what we call the minimum price or price floor. Now, I would analyze the implications of each of these before I move on to talk about the concept of elasticity. So, we would see that, well, government's intention is good because it wants to improve the welfare of some individuals in the society, but it might end up worsening their welfare if care is not taken. So let's quickly look at these two forms of price controls, and then, of course, before we move on to discuss the concept of elasticity. But I saw some two hands up. I think they have lowered them now. So I don't think it's to ask any question. If it's to ask a question, you can raise it. Right, then I can unmute you. Okay, so to explain this concept of price control, I want to switch to the whiteboard, There are no diagrams in the slides to explain it, but I want to use diagram in the whiteboard to explain the two forms of price control, which is maximum price or the price ceiling, and then there is also the minimum price or the price for floor. So I want to share my whiteboard with you. Okay, so on my whiteboard, I first of all want to look at the maximum price, right? Maximum price. So let's see when this is used by the government. So in some situations, government may feel, or the consensus will be that the price that is being charged by producers or the price that the market has detected is an over exploitive price, or it's exploiting consumers in the market. In other words, the those on the demand side of the market are being exploited. So government can decide to say that, okay, I do not agree with the price that has been detected by the market, so I want to fix a price. So I'll fix a price obviously below what the market has been detected. If the interest is to to protect consumers, then you cannot fix a price that is above the equilibrium price, because that is the price you think it's exploitative. So you fix a price that is below the equilibrium price, and that price is a maximum price that the item can be sold at, right? It can be sold below it, but it cannot be sold above that maximum price or the price ceiling. So you set a ceiling that nobody should go above it, but you can go below it. Okay. Now let's analyze the implication of this policy on the market. And I'm going to use the market for housing, for instance, accommodation, right? And we would focus on only a one-bedroom apartment, for instance. So I want to draw the equilibrium for this market. So the price, of course, will be the rent paid for a one-bedroom apartment, and then the quantity of the one-bedroom apartment. So this is the demand for a one-bedroom apartment. Let's assume this is the supply for a one-bedroom apartment, right? Let's assume again that the market equilibrium price is, let's say, 500 Ghana cedi per month for a one-bedroom apartment, right? And given this, we have equilibrium quantity of, let's say, 2,000 one-bedroom apartment. So government thinks that this 500 is too much for consumers. Consumers cannot pay, but that is what the market has fixed. So government decides to control this price by fixing rent for a one-bedroom apartment. And this rent, of course, would have to be below the equilibrium price. So let's say it fixes it below it, below the equilibrium price of, let's say, 200 Ghana. Government says that the rent per month for a one-bedroom apartment should not be more than 200 Ghana. So that's what government says. And anyone who charges more than 200 Ghana is committing an illegality. So government can come up with stringent measures, that will punish people who will charge more than 200 Ghana. Okay. Now let's see the problems that this policy will lead to. Now, if from the discussions we've had previously, we know that if the price, that's the market price, is below the equilibrium price, the problem that is created is what? A shortage. So you see that at the price of 200, demand for one bedroom apartment is greater than supply for one bedroom apartment. So there is a shortage that has been created as a result of the policy. So a shortage has been created as a result of the policy. So what government can do is to supply the excess demand of one bedroom apartment so that no one would suffer. But in the event that government does not or cannot supply the shortage, then there will be a problem. The problem is that it might lead to what we call black market or the underground economy, which is we would have some tenants who want one bedroom apartment but are not getting because it is short in supply. That what has been supplied is not enough to meet what is in demand or demand. So we'll have people who want it but are not getting it. So what would they do? They will convince landlords to give it to them at higher rates, but it is illegal. So they are not going to tell anyone that they are paying more than the 200. So landlords too, as long as they are willing to keep their mouth shut and not go and tell anyone, the landlords would offer it to them. So what we will see is that in the end, consumers might end up paying even more than the 500, right? Which is the market clearing rent. Consumers might end up paying even more than the 500. But what we would have is an underground economy or a black market, an illegal market that would arise as a result of that. So unless government is willing to supply the shortage, this policy would lead to the underground economy or what we call a black market. Another effect of this is that now if resource owners, particularly the landlords, realize that their investment is not yielded them enough returns, what we will find is that in the long run, they will start converting one bedroom apartment to something else, to something that government has not regulated. So maybe they will start converting it to commercial shops or something other, some other things. That would even worsen the shortage situation in the long run because you find landlords now converting their one bedroom apartment to a different thing or something that is of different use, and that will mean that the shortage will even be worsened in the long run, right? So this is a good policy. Government wants to protect consumers, but if government is not in a position to supply the shortage of accommodation or the one bedroom apartment, then these are the things that are likely to happen. We might have the underground economy or the black market, and then we can also have a situation where resources are shifted from the production of one bedroom apartment to something else, and that will even end up worsening the shortage situation, right? So I have a question here. Okay, that will end up worsening the shortage situation. All right. Okay. So now let's look at the second scenario, which is the minimum price. Right, the second scenario, which is the minimum price. So the minimum price is used when government thinks that producers, in this case, producers, not consumers, producers are not getting what is actually due them. So minimum price or the price floor. So producers are not getting what is actually due them. So the market has come up with a price, but that price does not favor producers. So government decides to set a price that will be beneficial to producers. And to do that, since the existing price is not beneficial to them, then you cannot set a lower price. You cannot set a price that is below the equilibrium as a minimum price. Right. So what we do is the government sets a price that is above the equilibrium price. So but that is the floor. So you cannot go beyond it. So when we talk of a floor, it means you can't go beyond it. So that's why it has the name price floor. So that is the minimum price you can sell the item. You cannot sell it below that price, but it can be above. Right? Consumers can pay a price that is above the minimum price, but you cannot pay a price that is below the minimum price. So an example would be the market for any agricultural products. Let's say maybe tomatoes, right? So this is the price per kilo or per box for tomato. Let's say 100 cedis per box of a tomato of tomatoes, right? And that gives us we can buy let's say 1,000 box. The equilibrium market is 1,000 boxes. So government thinks that this 100 Ghana cedi per box is too small. So farmers should benefit more. So it decides to set a minimum price of 150. Right? Government decides to set a minimum price of 150. Right? So that nobody should buy a box of tomatoes below 150. You can buy it above 150. Now let's see what a problem this results in. The problems that this policy would result in. One, you will see that at that 150, the demand for tomatoes will be lower than the supply for tomatoes. Right? Demand for tomatoes would be lower than supply for tomatoes. Now, if that is the case, then we have what? A surplus. As we had, I mean, some examples, explanation of. So we have a surplus, and we know what the surplus will cause from the previous discussions that we've had. But in this case, because it's not a free market system, it is a controlled price. The market forces cannot push price down to the equilibrium. So price has to remain at 150. Now, if government is ready to supply the surplus, sorry, to buy the surplus, if government is ready to buy the surplus, then there's no problem, right? The market can deal with a price of 150 as long as the surplus is purchased by the government. But in the event that government can't purchase the surplus, then we have a big issue, right? So the tomatoes are perishable, that if you keep it for long, it will spoil. So if people are not buying tomatoes, what the producers of tomatoes would obviously do is to start reducing the price of tomatoes so that it will convince consumers to buy. Now, if we do not take care, it might even lead to a situation where producers might be receiving price that is even lower than the equilibrium price. right? So they'll be receiving price that is even lower than equilibrium price. And that way, the policy might not have achieved its purpose. But it is illegal, anyway, to pay a price that is lower than the equilibrium, lower than the minimum price, right? It's illegal to do that. But of course, producers want their produce to go. So what do they do? What do they do? They charge or they offer it at a price that is lower than the price that has been set by the state. Okay, so you can also look at other problems that can come with a minimum price. Okay, so in Ghana, for instance, a typical example of this is the minimum wage. So a minimum wage has been set by the state, and that workers should not pay anything lower than the minimum wage, right? So a minimum wage has been set, and workers should not pay anything lower than the minimum wage, right? So I can see some messages in my chat dialogue. Let me go and check what um, they are, then I can come back. So that is what so NEO2. That's precisely the point we are saying that the bargaining power will be with the consumer because he knows that there's excess supply of the product, so there's a surplus. So the producer bargains with the consumer and then offer a price that is even lower than the the minimum price that has been set by the state. Right? So that's precisely the point you are making. So the producers will end up receiving prices that are lower than what the state has set. Okay. Any question on this before I move on to the concept of elasticity? There's another state intervention that I will be looking at, and that has to do with the issue of a tax. So aside setting minimum price and then even maximum price, or aside price control, the state also intervenes by introducing taxes on the commodities that are sold in the market. So we will look at how that affects the equilibrium price and quantity later on. So before I move on to talk about the concept of elasticity, if you have any question on this, you can ask now. Somebody wants to know the definition of a price control. I think it's quite obvious. It's when the state dictates the price that the market should sell the commodity. So you are fixing the price. When we say you are controlling price, it means you are fixing the price for the market. That's basically that. Right? So you fix the price for the market. The price is not what the market has dictated, but government decides to fix it. You control it. You regulate it. You are the one who is fixing it. Right. So there's a question here on a surplus. Can I accept surplus as when the market has more than accepted product to an extent that consumers can reach out easily to it and therefore ask for bargaining? Well, maybe you want to define surplus. I don't know why you want to complicate things for yourself, Patrick. Surplus is when demand or supply is greater than demand in the market. That's all. Why do you want to complicate things for yourself? And then, okay, so there's another question. Yes, so Prince Tavia, there is a surplus when supply exceeds demand. That is when we have a surplus, right? Or there is excess supply. Surplus is the same as excess supply. So when supply exceeds demand, then you have surplus. Okay, if you don't have any other question on this, then I can move on to the concept of elasticity. So I can move on to the concept of elasticity. Okay, so now let's go on to the concept of elasticity. Right, so we have looked at demand and also look at supply, and we know the factors that influence demand and the factors that also influences supply. And we can clearly tell the direction of change when there's a change in any of these factors. So for instance, if you pick price, for instance, the law of demand says that as price increases, quantity demanded would fall, and vice versa. Income, if the good is a normal good, as income increases, quantity demand would increase. And if it's an inferior good, as income increases, demand will fall. And then we also talk about the other factors such as price related, or price of a related commodity, and all that. Okay. Now, what we did not discuss or talk about is the extent of the change in demand when there is a change in the factor that influences demand. The extent, right? So we know that when price increases, demand will fall. But fall by how much? Is it going to fall by more or fall by less? When income increases, if the good is a normal good, we know demand is going to increase. Increase by how much? Less or more, right? It's important that we know the extent to which demand change or supply change when there is a change in a factor that influences it. And that's what we are going to do now with the concept of elasticities. So the the elasticities that we are going to it will help us to understand the extent to which demand for a particular product or supply for a particular product respond to changes in the factors that influences demand and also supply. So by the end of this section, these are the things that I expect you to be able to do to understand how to measure how consumers demand will respond to changes in the factors that influence it. In other words, just understand how consumer demand responds to changes in the factors that influence it. The second one is with supply. So understand how changes in the factors that influences supply or how supply respond to the changes in the factors that influences supply. Right. So those are the things that I expect you to be able to do by the end of these sections. Although I'm not going to complete it today. The target is to get to finish their own price elasticity of demand. So let's start. Elasticity in economics, right? Elasticity is the measure of the responsiveness of one variable to a change in another variable. Right? So it is the measure of the responsiveness of one variable to the change in another variable. So in the case of demand, so the variable in question is the demand, and the other variables are price, income, taste and preferences, price of related commodities, and all the other factors that influences demand. So when we say elasticity of demand, then we are measuring how demand is responsive to a change in a factor that influences demand. And the same thing with supply. So supply is one variable, and the other variables are price, the price of related commodity in production, and then many other factors that influences demand supply. So when we talk of elasticity of supply, then we are looking at how supply respond to a change in a factor that influences supply. Okay, so we are going to look at both elasticities, the one for supply and then the one for demand. So we will start with demand elasticity first. And under demand elasticity, we are going to consider three factors that influences demand. And these factors are the price of the commodity itself, the price of a related commodity in consumption, and also income of the consumer. So these are the three demand factors that we will be measuring its elasticity for. Right. So for instance, when we look at the price, we will be measuring how quantity demand for a product is responsive to a change in the price. If it is price of related commodities, we call it the cross price elasticity. How demand for a particular product respond to a change in the price of a related commodity. And of course, the last one is the income elasticity. How demand for a product respond to a change in income for consumers. Okay, so we will first of all start with the own price elasticity of demand. So note that when we get to supply too, we are going to do similar things. So let's first of all start with the own price elasticity of demand. And then when we finish, we'll look at cross price elasticity of demand and then also look at income elasticity of demand. So own price elasticity of demand, that's what I want us to look at first. So what is own price elasticity of demand? So for own price elasticity of demand, it is the measure of the responsiveness of quantity demand or quantity demanded to changes in the price of the good itself, right? So for some commodities, you would see that when price change, consumers do not vary their demand by that much. But for some commodities, you see that the slightest change in price, consumers vary their demand by a huge amount, right? So price elasticity of demand or own price elasticity of demand is the responsiveness or the measure of the responsiveness of quantity demanded to changes in the price of the good. Now, how do we measure it or how do we find the own price elasticity of demand? It is obtained by the formula you see on your screen, which is the percentage change in quantity divided by the percentage change in price, right? So note that if we are measuring responsiveness, so it means that we have two different values. So the variable was at one value and then it changed. And if it changed, to what extent does the other variable change? So in this case, the two variables are quantity demanded and then the price. So price change from one level to another level. To what extent does quantity demanded change as a result of that? So therefore, to find the own price elasticity of demand, it is obtained by dividing the percentage change in quantity divided by the percentage change in price. Now one would ask, how do I find the percentage change in quantity? And how do I find the percentage change in price? Now to explain that, I'm going to use a general formula. How do we find a percentage change in a variable? Right? How do you find a percentage change in a variable? To do that, let me just switch to the whiteboard to explain how you find a percentage change in a variable. So let's say the variable is x, and I want to find the percentage change in x. So the percentage change in x is the new value of x. So x new minus x old, or the initial value of x, divided by x old, and then you multiply everything by 100. That gives you the percentage change in x. So if I want to apply it to quantity, then the percentage change in quantity will be the new quantity. So let me call that Q2 minus the old quantity, let me call that Q1, divided by the old quantity, let me call that Q1, and then multiply this by 100. So that will give me the percentage change in quantity. So the percentage change in price will also be equal to the new price, let me call that P2, minus the old price, let me call that P1. You divide your answer by P1, and again you multiply by 100. That gives you the percentage change, right? So elasticity, which is EP, will be equal to the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price, right? So please take note of that. Now, because the demand curve is downward sloping, at least that is what we are assuming. We are not assuming that we will have a given good case. So we are assuming that the demand curve is downward sloping, right? So if that is the case, it means that there is an inverse relationship between the price of a commodity and then the quantity demanded for that commodity. And that means that elasticity or price elasticity of demand, when calculated, should always be negative. Please take note of this. Because the demand curve is downward sloping, or it shows there is what do you call it? Because it shows that there's an inverse relationship between the price of a good and also the quantity demanded for that good. Elasticity, in this case, own price elasticity, when calculated, should always be negative, right? Own price elasticity, when calculated, should always be negative, right? No. So confidence is asking whether he can define um, elasticity using the formula. No, if you use only the formula, you will not get full marks. So you have to start by saying that elasticity is the measure, or own price elasticity is the degree of responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in price, or it's a measure of how quantity demanded respond to a change in price. And it is obtained by percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. So that's how you should write it. If you just write only the formula, you don't get full marks. If it is 5, I give you 1.5. Okay, so let's move on. Right. So like I was saying, I'm saying that given that demand curve is down sloping, or there's an inverse relationship between the price of a good and then the quantity demanded, the own price elasticity of demand, anytime you calculate it, should give you a negative answer. If you don't get a negative answer, then you have made a mistake. It should always be negative, right? So we'll take an example along the line. But before I go ahead to take an example, we can also distinguish between point price elasticity of demand and then the arc price elasticity of demand. So let's look at that. A point price elasticity of demand and then the arc elasticity or price elasticity of demand. And the difference between the two is that the point is finding elasticity at a specific point on the demand curve, whilst the arc is finding elasticity for a range on the demand curve. Okay, so the elasticity formula that we obtain, which is percentage change in quantity over percentage change in price. Now this same formula can be simplified to or rewritten as change in quantity over change in price times price over quantity. You can rewrite this as that, right? Now, if you are asked to find elasticity at a point, then the P and Q is the point in which you are finding the elasticity. So elasticity at a point, right? So the P will be specified and then the Q will also be specified. So the point can either be at the initial values or the new values. So that is why you find, so point elasticity, you find elasticity at a particular point on the demand curve. But for the arc elasticity, you find it for a range, right? And therefore, so for the range, it is, you find the average of prices. So if it is the arc elasticity, then it will be change in demand over change in price, but times, now the P is the range of P, and the range is the new and then the initial. So it's going to be the new P plus the old P, which is P1. You find the average of that divided by 2. And then the quantity 2 will be the new quantity plus the old quantity, Q1. And you divide that 2 by 2. And that gives you so this will give you the arc elasticity of demand. So let's take an example. Let's take an example that we can calculate all these forms of elasticity. So let's say there's a commodity, the price was 5, quantity demanded is 10, and then the price increases to 10, quantity demanded is 2. So you're asked to find the own price elasticity of demand. If you are not told to find point elasticity of demand or arc elasticity of demand, and you are just told find the own price elasticity of demand, then use the first formula, which is, so the own price elasticity of demand, the first formula, it is the percentage change in quantity divided by the percentage change in price. So that's what you should use if you are not told to either find point elasticity or arc elasticity. Always use the percentage change in quantity divided by the percentage change in price. So let's move on. Let's find the percentage change in quantity. Quantity was 10 and it went to 2. So the change will be 2 minus 10, right? All over 2 times, sorry, all over 10, because 10 is the old one. All over 10 times, okay, let me then times 100. Then we also have for price, the new price is 10 minus the old price is 5 divided by 5, and then you multiply everything to by 100, that by 100. So this will be equal to, so 2 minus 10 is minus 8 over 10 will be minus 80%. So if you multiply it by 100, it gives you 80%. Divided by 10 minus 5 over 5, that is also 1, so that is 100%. So if you find 80% over 100%, you get negative 0.8. So this is your own price elasticity of demand based on the FAIRS formula, right? Own price elasticity of demand based on the FAIRS formula. Yes, so if you want to work as Amwa Andrews, yes, you can work it separately and just go and substitute. What I'm interested in is the percentage change in quantity divided by the percentage change in price. So if you want to work them separately and substitute them, that is fine. All right. Now, assuming you are asked to find a point, so the point elasticity, right? So we know it is change in quantity divided by change in price times price over quantity. So the change here, so let's look at, so quantity was 10 and it went to 2. So the change is minus 8. So then the new minus old will be minus 8. And then for price, it was 5 and then went to 10. So the change is 5. Now multiply by, so this is where the point elasticity comes in. So let's measure it at the initial point, at the initial price. So at the initial price, P is 5 at the initial price, and then quantity is 10 at the initial price. So we are multiplying this. So this will cancel that, and we will be left with again minus 0.8, right? So if you want to find it at the new prices, then instead of 5 and 10, you will have what do you call it? Price will be 10, and then quantity will be 2. So it will be 10 and then 2. If it is to find, if you are to find it at the new price. But if it were to be arc, if it were to be arc elasticity, then we are going to have the change in quantity divided by change in price multiplied by price is the new P2 plus P1 divided by 2 all over Q2 plus Q1 also divided by 2. So I know the change in quantity is minus 8. The change in price is 5. And then multiply by Now the sum of the P. So P was 5 and then 15. Sorry, 5 and 10. So that's 15. 15 divided by 2 is 7.5. And then the change in the quantity 2, it was 10 plus 2, that is 12, divided by 2, that will be 6. So you work it out, and that will give you the arc elasticity of demand. So for those who cannot hear, I think it is your internet. If you can't hear, it's your internet. Belinda, so you might have to check your internet. Okay, so what somebody else. So Belinda, somebody has asked a question about whether um, whether when you state the formula with alphabet P and Q, you are to explain what the alphabet mean as P1 equal to new. You don't need to do all that. I mean, of course, we know that P is price and then Q is quantity. Okay. So somebody says, Balfour says the answer is different. You mean, of course, the answer for arc elasticity will not be the same as the point elasticity. So if that's what you mean, Balfour, yes, the answer will be different. So the arc elasticity is measuring elasticity within a range. So it will not be the same as the point elasticity. Okay, so that is how you can calculate elasticity. Now let me just switch to the slides, and then so you have this. So I've explained all these types. So I've explained to you that elasticity or own price elasticity should always be negative when calculated. The point has been made, point elasticity has been explained, and also the arc elasticity has also been explained. So there's an example here that asks you to calculate the elasticity. So I will urge you to do it on your own when you have free time to do. So now let's move on to how we can interpret elasticity. How can we interpret the elasticity values? How can we interpret the elasticity value? No, 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 no. The final answer, you don't need to add the percentage. So Elizabeth is asking. The final answer, well, you can, if you want, you can express it in percentages. But if you are interpreting it, you can say if this goes up by 1%, then yeah, quantity demanded will fall. So don't add, you can decide to leave the percentage out. Right, okay. I don't know which final answer is -2. I don't know which answer you are saying is -2 anyway. So okay. Now let's go on to discuss. Let's go on to discuss the interpretation of the elasticities, right? How to interpret the elasticities, right? So let's go and do that. And I'm going to switch to my whiteboard to do that. Okay. So I'll stop sharing this and then switch to the whiteboard. Okay. So now, like I said, when you calculate elasticity, your answer should be negative. Your answer should be negative. However, when you are interpreting it, we interpret it without the negative sign. So we use the absolute value. But anytime you calculate it, you should always get a negative figure. And for that reason, since elasticity should always be negative, we can neglect the negative when we are interpreting it, because we don't have a situation where it can be positive unless you are dealing with a given good case, right? So if it's always negative, then we can interpret it without the negative sign. So the reason why they own price elasticity using the major or the first formula, and then the point is the same, is because, like I told you, the first formula is what we simplify to have the point, but we can vary the point in terms of whether we are using it at the initial point or the new point. If you use the initial point, it will give you the same answer as the first one, right? Yeah, so like I was saying, you can interpret it without the negative sign. So interpretation, let's look at how elasticities can behave. One, the absolute value. So now I'm using absolute to mean that the negative sign has been dropped. The absolute value can be greater than 1. And if it is greater than 1, we say that the product has an elastic demand. So if it's greater than 1, it means the product has an elastic demand, right? In other words, the demand is very sensitive. Demand is very sensitive, responsive or sensitive. So whichever way you want to do. Demand is responsive to price change. To price change. And to have this, by the formula, the percentage change in quantity demanded will be greater than the percentage change in price. So if price change by, let's say, 1% and demand changes by more than 1%, then the product is said to be demand elastic or has an elastic demand. It means that consumers are very sensitive to price changes. Right. The second one is when it is less than 1, the absolute value is less than 1, then we have an inelastic demand. So we have an inelastic demand, right? So the product is less sensitive, so less responsive. No. So less responsive to price change. So less responsive to price change. In that sense, the percentage change in quantity demanded is lower than the percentage change in price, right? And then we have the another one, the third one, where it is equal to 1. So in that sense, we have a unitary elastic. So it means that when you change quantity price by 1%, quantity also changes by 1%. So the percentage change in quantity in this case will be equal to the percentage change in price, right? And then in addition to these three, we have two extremes. There is two extreme cases that I want us to consider. There are two extreme cases. One is that we can have it to be zero. So it's equal to zero. Now, if it is equal to zero, then we call it perfectly. We call it perfectly inelastic. So it means that quantity demanded is not responsive at all to price changes. Quantity demanded not responsive at all to price changes, right? So quantity demanded is not responsive at all to price changes. No matter how you change price, quantity demanded will not change. It will remain the same. Now, if a good has these characteristics, or demand for a particular commodity has these characteristics, then the demand curve is slightly different from the usual demand curve that we know. So for a good that is perfectly inelastic, the demand curve is vertical. So this is the vertical demand curve, indicating that no amount of change in price will change quantity. Quantity will continue to remain the same, even no matter how you change price, right? And then the last extreme case is when the price elasticity of demand is equal to infinity. And that one we call it perfectly elastic. So perfectly elastic. Perfectly elastic. In that sense, demand is very, very, very sensitive to price changes. So demand is very, I can use the word very, very to stress on that. So very, very sensitive to price changes, to P change. Very, very sensitive. The slightest change in price, small change in price, will lead to a bigger change in quantity demanded. Right. Now, again, that also has a different demand curve. For a product that is perfectly elastic, the demand curve is horizontal. For a product that is perfectly elastic, the demand curve is horizontal. Right. So these two demand curves are different from the conventional demand curve that we know. And it's to reflect that um, I don't know what you mean by fairly elastic. Which one? So we can say fairly elastic for the first one. demand elastic. When demand is said to be elastic, it can be said to be fairly elastic. So it is very, more responsive. Okay, let me use the word more responsive to price changes. Right? It's more responsive to price changes. Okay, so that's the interpretation. How you interpret the elasticity. So unitary is saying that a 1% change in price will lead to a 1% change in quantity demanded, right? So if you change price by 100%, quantity demanded will also change by 100%. That's what we mean by the unitary elastic, right? Okay. Now, let me switch to the slides and then we can take, or before that, maybe let me take some questions from you before I move on to discuss the determinants of price elasticity of demand. So what will make the demand for a particular good more elastic than another demand, more price elastic than another good, right? So in other words, what are the determinants of own price elasticity of demand? That's what I want us to do next. But before that, you can ask questions if you have. Raise your hand up if you have a question. If you cannot raise your hand up too, you can type and then we will look at it. Okay. Yes, so one would Balfour is asking whether we can use diagram to explain elastic, inelastic, and other. Yes, you can use diagrams. I don't know if it is important to do that at this point, but I can explain that for you. It's not really something you should bother yourself so much with, but let me show you. Maybe you are more curious, you have learned more, so you want to know it, but it's not something you should worry yourself so much. So if a product is, so the shapes of the demand curve will tell the elasticity. So if I have two demand curves, one is steeper and one is flatter. The one that is flatter is said to be more elastic than the one that is steeper. Okay, so this flat one, DF, will be more elastic, and D, let's say A, will be less elastic. So the unitary, you can draw a straight line just to pass through it, which divides the quadrant into two. So I can call D and B. You can say that is the unitary. Right? But we don't bother so much about the unitary. So it is about elastic or inelastic. So if you have two demand curves, one is flatter than the other. The flatter one is an elastic demand curve. And then the steeper one is the inelastic one. Okay, so that explains that for you, Bafo. But it's not something you should bother yourself about. This is not mainstream economics. So okay. So let's move on to any other question. If you have any other question, raise your hand up or you type it in the chat dialogue. Any question? If you have any question, please raise your hand up or you type it in the chat dialogue. So I have Roger. Roger, go ahead.
Okay, sir. Please read the elasticity at the various points in calculating price
Yeah, I can't hear
elasticity.
you.
We know that, I mean, calculating the price elasticity.
Yes.
When we calculate, so can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
When we calculate the price elasticity and it shows -1, -2,
Yeah.
0, or 1 perfectly, how will we know if it's perfectly inelastic? Because it is infinity. So how will we know
How are
that
you going to
answer
do
that?
what?
How will we know if it's perfectly inelastic? That's the infinity you said.
Roger, I still can't get you. You said you
You
calculate
see,
elasticity and you have what?
when we have when the price elasticity is -1, it
It's
shows that
minus
it's
one.
unitary.
Uh-huh.
Yes, sir. It shows that it's unitary.
It's
When
what?
it's zero,
Unity.
yes, sir.
Yes.
When it's zero, it shows that it's perfectly inelastic.
Yes.
When it's -2, it shows that it is elastic.
Yes.
So I'm asking, how will we know when it's perfectly elastic? That's infinity.
You mean perfectly inelastic or elastic? But I thought I've used I used numbers to the what do you call it? The interpretation. If it is less than one, it is inelastic. So it's greater than zero but less than one. It's inelastic, isn't it? That's what I said, Roger. You can unmute yourself and ask. If it's infinity that you are talking of, so infinity, any number you divide by zero, right? That will give you an undefined. So that's the infinity figure that we are talking about. So I don't know what your question is, honestly.
Thank you, sir. It is answered.
Okay. How do the types of elasticity relate to any of the economic structures or market structures? Johnson, I don't know what you are talking about. Concern yourself with this one. Don't move to market structures yet. Right? So I don't even know what your question means. Let me get another. Someone has a hand up, but it has been lowered. It was Sadiq also. Sadiq, you can raise your hand up again if you still want to ask the question. Okay, so Sadiq, I've unmuted you.
Sir, please, if you are giving a question, if you are answering a question on the elasticity of demand, and you reach your final answer to be negative, are you to convert it to the absolute value or you leave it like
No,
that?
maintain it as negative. Your
Okay.
answer has to be negative. But when you're asked to interpret it, don't interpret it by adding the negative sign. You can just say, okay, -2 means that it is what? Elastic. Don't just
Oh,
add
okay.
the negative. That's all.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. All right. So now, if there are no other questions, then let's quickly look at the determinants of price elasticity of demand. All right. The determinants of price elasticity of demand. Now, it is in the slides, but it is later. But I want to pull it. Since I'm dealing with own price elasticity of demand, I want to complete everything on that. So I am bringing it forward, but it is in a slide. So for those who have read the slides ahead, they might see that there. So let's look at the determinants of the own price elasticity of demand. Samuel, how do you know what is elastic? Okay, so if you calculate it and it is greater than 1, it is demand elastic or elastic demand. If it's less than 1, it's an inelastic demand. If it is equal to 1, it is unitary. If it is equal to 0, we have perfectly inelastic. And if it's equal to infinity, we have perfectly elastic. So you will get the recordings, and I'm sure I have written everything on a whiteboard, so you will be able to see that. Therefore, you are just repeating the same things that I've said. Therefore, the same things that I said is what you are repeating. So when you say when there's a change in price, it leads to a small change in quantity demanded. So add the percentage. When there's a percentage change in price, it leads to a small percentage change in quantity demanded. I have said this 20 times before. It's the same things. You are just repeating the things that I've said. Okay. So now let's quickly look at the determinants of own price elasticity of demand. There are 4 factors that I want us to look at. One is the availability of substitute So the more substitutes there are for a particular product, the more elastic the product is, right? And the intuition is that, I mean, if a product has more substitute and you increase the price, consumers switched faster to the other products or other substitutes because the product becomes expensive, so they can easily switch. But if there are no substitute for it, or there aren't enough substitute for it, then they will not vary their consumption by that much. So the more substitutes there are for a product, the more elastic the product is. And the less substitute there are for a product, the less elastic the product is. 2, we have the issue of the proportion of income spent on the product, right? So the proportion of income spent on a product. Proportion of income spent on the product, right? So if you spend a higher proportion of your income on the product, then the product is likely to be very sensitive to price changes, right? But if you spend a small proportion, let's take salt, for instance, in a household. How much do we buy salt? 5 cedis or so. And that one is even, you use it more than 1 month, 2, 3 months. So you put all your salary for 3 months together and you are spending just 5 cedis on salt. If the price of salt doubles, you might not change your quantity for the quantity you consume for salt, right? But take rent, for instance. If your income, about 60% of it goes to pay your rent, and the rent is increased by even 100 Ghana cedi, in fact, you might even fight your landlord for doing that, right? So the bigger the proportion of your income spent on a product, the more elastic that product becomes, the more price elastic that product becomes. And if it's a smaller proportion, then you don't really care with price increases. Another example would be price, what do you call it? Bread. How much do you spend on bread? 1 cedi, 2 cedis. If the price of bread goes up, you would not respond too much to the changes in the price, right? Then we also have whether the product is a necessity or a luxury. So necessity, necessity or a luxury. So necessities are things you cannot live without. You need them to survive. So therefore, if price increases, you are not likely to vary your consumption by that much. So an example is food. For instance, we need food for survival. So if the price of food increases, you don't vary your consumption by that much. You are not so much responsive to the changes in the price of food. But for a luxury you can live without it. You know, assuming that I plan to go to Dubai and all that for a holiday, and all of a sudden the 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 travel agency decides to increase the price of tickets and all that, I can shun it altogether because it I can live without it, right? So necessities or luxuries. So necessities tend to have a lower price elasticity of demand, but luxuries have a higher price elasticity of demand. And then the last one is the time period. So whether it is a short run or the long run. So time period. So we have short run, and then we have long run. So in the short run, the demand is inelastic in the short run. The reason is that you haven't had time to check other places for the same product, and therefore you would continue to buy. But in the long run, where you have had time to check other places for the same product, you would react more to a change in price, right? Where you now know that, oh, I can get a similar product here and all that. Okay, so these are the four factors that can influence their own price elasticity of demand. So if you see that a good is more sensitive to price changes, ask your question. Ask yourself, oh, does a good have more substitute? How much does consumers spend on, what proportion of consumers' income is spent on that commodity? Is it a necessity or a luxury? And then the time period as well. Okay. So this is where I plan to end today's class. Next week, oh no, this week, of course, when we have our next meeting, I will look at cross price elasticity of demand, look at income elasticity of demand, and then I'll switch to supply and then even start consumer behavior as well, or consumer theory. So before I end the class, let me give you just 2 minutes for questions, then I'll end. So 2 minutes for questions, and then I'll end the class. So Howard, the time period, there are two time periods. We have a short run. So short run is the short period within where you haven't had time to go and ask people for alternatives, right? Well, the short run and the long run would differ depending on the individual. So for instance, I can have a short run to be 3 months. Somebody will have long run to be more than 3 months. So I'll say that within 3 months where I haven't had time to ask people about the availability of the product somewhere else, I'll be responding less to the price changes, right? I won't respond more to the price changes when I haven't had time to ask. So that's what we mean by the short run period. But in the long run, when I have asked people, it has taken a long time, I've asked people, and then people would have told me that, oh, the same product, you can get it here, you can get it that, and all that. I would now respond more to changes in prices, right? So that's the thing. I don't know what is so difficult about this availability of substitutes. You know what substitutes are. So if you have a product and it has other substitutes or other products that can perform the same function as that product, and you increase the price of the product, that product become expensive. So consumers switched to other products. So if you have more products that can serve the same purpose as the product that you have in question and you increase the price, consumers respond more to price changes. That's all. So products that have more substitute would have an elastic demand compared to those that have less substitute. All right. Proportion of income, I think I've made point. I've explained this thing more than enough. And if you spend a smaller proportion of your income, I use the example of salt, right? How much do you spend on salt? 5 Ghana cedi or 10 Ghana cedi out of your income of, let's say, 2,000 Ghana or 3,000 Ghana cedi. If the price of salt doubles, you will not even change your consumption of the quantities that you purchase for salt. You might buy the same thing. So it's because you spend a very small amount of your income on it. But if you are spending like 50%, 60% of your income on salt, and the price of salt doubles, you see how you are going to react. You find ways to minimize the consumption of salt. Right? Okay, so so I think I'll end here. Some of the questions, I don't know when I was teaching them whether they were sleeping or not, but if you get the recordings, you will get what I mean. Okay, so the recordings, like I said, I couldn't send it through WhatsApp because I'm told it's now becoming bigger. So I will be doing that through the Telegram now. So once this is converted, I will send this to you and the other ones as well. So have a good evening. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye bye.